Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammad Tawakkoli, the inaugural director of the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you to today's panel discussion on Iran, the Holocaust, and World War II, featuring Dr. Arash Azizi, Professor Jennifer Jenkins, and Professor Lior Sternfeld. This panel is organized in collaboration with the Anne Tanenbaum Centre for Jewish Studies, the Iranian Studies Student Forum, the Encyclopedia Iranica Foundation, and Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute. For this collaborative initiative, I am particularly grateful to Professor Anne Tanenbaum, the Center for Jewish Studies Director and Professor of Yiddish Studies at the University of Toronto. I'm also thankful to distinguished members of our panel for accepting our invitation to discuss a rarely known chapter of modern Iranian history. At the outset, and before introducing our speakers, I would like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, teach, and learn on their ancestral homeland. My colleague, Professor Anne Tanenbaum, will introduce our speakers and moderate today's session. Please.
Thank you, Professor Tawakkoli. Hi, my name is Anne Tanenbaum. As Professor Tawakkoli said, I'm director of Anne Tanenbaum Centre for Jewish Studies, and I have to say I'm so excited both about this event, but also that this is the first event in history of both of our centers, that Mir-Djalali Institute for Iranian Studies and Anne Tanenbaum Centre for Jewish Studies are working together, and what panel we brought for you. It is a distinguished panel that pushes the boundaries of Holocaust studies, studies of Jewish history in Iran and all that. And also, of course, it's an special excitement for all of us because one of the presenters is our former student. Dr. Arash Azizi was an undergraduate student here in Toronto. I don't want to tell you how many years ago because that will age me more than I'm prepared for this distinguished audience. But, it is a triumphant homecoming moment. And as teachers and professors, we cannot be more excited when our students come here and push the boundaries of the field and scholarship. So very excited to be here for this moment. So I will now introduce our speakers more formally. First, we will hear from my local superstar colleague, historian, Professor Jennifer Jenkins, who is a global and German historian who writes on Iran from the perspective of international diplomacy and political economy. She holds the position of an associate chair and Canada Research Chair in German history here at the University of Toronto. She has published widely on German-Iranian connections and now is finishing a book called The Persian Question, Germany, Iran, and in the Near East in the Age of Empire. As far as I understand, Jennifer was a key person who organized a panel, very similar panel on Iran, Holocaust, and World War II with Arash at the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington. So we're getting a preview or repeat of that panel?
An extension, a development.
Improved version.
Development.
Sequel.
Yes. Yeah. And then our second speaker joining us from Zoom universe is Professor Lior Sternfeld, who holds the position of William and Charlotte Duddy University Endowed Fellow in Humanities and Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Penn State. He is the author of a book called Between Iran and Zion, Jewish Histories of 20th Century Iran, which came out from Stanford University Press in 2018. And he will be presenting some of that research for us. And last but not least is, of course, Dr. Arash Azizi, who is a writer and a historian, super fancy schmancy published author in Atlantic, I'm just saying. Look it up. He is now holding a position of a visiting fellow at Boston University's Frederick's Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. And continues to write on his commentary on politics, history, and cinema. I already mentioned Atlantic, but also New York Times, New York Review of Books, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek. I think a workshop on how to get such an impressive audience would be also useful for us. And he is the author of The Shadow Commander, Soleimani, U.S. and Iran's Global Admission, the book that came out from One World in 2020. So we will start with Professor Jenkins, and then go with Professor Sternfeld, and then with Dr. Azizi. So Professor Jenkins,
thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much. It's so great to be here and to see all of you. I'm Jennifer Jenkins. I'm a historian. I'm going to give some background on our two big topics. So Iran in World War II and it's the place of Iran in histories of Holocaust survival, both of which are largely unknown topics. And I can't take credit for being I was at the recent research consultation at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which was amazing, and the co-conveners of it were Arash and Lior. But there was some work that Mohammed and I did some years ago on Tehran in the Second World War that was a kind of spark for a number of discussions. So I'm just going to jump right in.
We were inspired by your work in organizing the conference.
The panels.
No, it's true.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's not
Okay.
flattery.
Thank you. I'm going to jump right in. Okay, with a picture that you probably know. Okay, with the Tehran Conference of 1943 is a celebrated event in the history of World War II diplomacy. Over 4 days in November, December 1943, the leaders of the Grand Alliance, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, discussed the war and the peace. They met at the Soviet embassy in Tehran, and the Big Three, as they came to be called, planned for the opening of a second front in Europe. They planned also for the defeat and dismemberment of Nazi Germany. They discussed Poland's boundaries. They broached the topic of the post-war world order that would be based on the United Nations principles and Franklin Roosevelt's idea of the four policemen. At dinner on December the 1st, 1943, the conference's last day, they signed a joint declaration on Iran, each pledging, in the presence of the others, to respect the country's autonomy, sovereignty, and independence. That's kind of the general narrative about the Tehran Conference, and the conference was undoubtedly a very important event, generated iconic images of the Big Three, yet most who see this image do not know that the picture was taken in Tehran, or if they do know that fact, it's kind of on the level of anecdotal information. The Iranian context is cropped out of the photo, much as the Iranian context of the conference has effectively been removed from narratives of wartime diplomacy. One can add to these omissions. The war is really not present in Iranian history. The 1940s are an under-researched period in Iran's national history, and Iran does not yet have a real presence in Holocaust history. So these are two issues that we are addressing today. We're saying that both of these are wrong, that both of these should be addressed. So I'm going to talk about Iran in the global context of the 1930s and 40s, and I'm going to focus specifically on two connected issues. First, the very particular occupation that unfolds in Iran after 1941, and the presence in the country of hundreds of thousands of wartime refugees coming from Poland, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union, including Holocaust refugees. The particular character of the occupation was the foundation for how the country became a place of refuge. And this was a work with many actors: diplomats, the Iranian parliament, soldiers and military personnel from Britain, Soviet Union, the United States, international aid organizations of different kinds, medical personnel, Iranian citizens and local civil society groups, and the refugees themselves. At the time of this picture, Tehran itself was a city of refugees. And the occupation story and the refugee story are inextricably linked. So if we're looking for connections between Iranian studies and Holocaust studies, this topic is prime terrain. So it's not happenstance that the powers meet in Tehran. Stalin famously would not travel outside the Soviet sphere, kind of for good reasons, and the meeting was held at the Soviet embassy. And Iran itself was arguably the most important non-combatant zone in the war period. It is the vital geography for the war against Nazi Germany. It is the crucial military supply zone, what was called the Persian Corridor. The US military called it the bridge to victory, through which the United States shipped billions of dollars of Lend-Lease war material into the Soviet Union between 1942 and 1945. When Roosevelt landed in Tehran in November 1943, he viewed with pleasure the rows of US fighter jets on the tarmac that were en route to the Red Army. So due to its role as this Lend-Lease corridor, Iran becomes the site of a unique occupation. It's in close proximity to the battlefields of southern Russia, Stalingrad most notably, to the Caucasus and Ukraine, while also protected from them. So Iran becomes a place in which people, armies, refugees, and ideas intensely mix. Only in Iran, this is important, only in Iran was this alliance realized locally and in real time. Only in Tehran did administrators and soldiers of the Big Three interact face to face. Now, two of the occupiers were familiar. Iran's old enemies, Russia and Britain. They had old goals in mind, and they entrenched themselves once again in the country's north and south. The third power was the United States, which was an unknown quantity in this context, an emerging global force with a developing sense of strategy and a desire to experiment. Its interest in Iran was primarily military at first, but then increasingly came to focus on Iran's place in the post-war peace. This was important to Roosevelt. He said that Iran would be a test case for the principles of the Atlantic Charter. Now, the Iranian government, by which I mean Mohammad Reza Shah, newly installed after the abdication of his father, the Iranian parliament, and a highly active and politicized public sphere, was positioned kind of between all of the occupying powers. And with the removal of Reza Shah and the end of his autocracy, politics and political discussion flowered in Iran as never before. So to the first point, and what do I click here for, and then there we go, whoops. The first point, to the occupation, a preliminary note is necessary. In the 20th century and in the 19th century too, Iran has often been either on a fault line between global systems or is itself the fault line between different global systems. It was ground zero of the so-called Great Game between Russia and Great Britain, and this led to the partitioning of the country in 1907. In the 1930s and up to 1941, as you see here, Iran is a part of the Nazi German trade zone. There was a small, and to look at this Nazi influence in Iran, there is a small but vocal Nazi party in Iran that's mainly made up of Germans or German exiles coming out of the Soviet Union. A small but vocal Nazi party in Iran. Many of Germany's largest companies were building industrial infrastructure in the country, as some of it's noted on the slide. I'm going to run through these kind of quickly. We could come back to them in the discussion. But there's a big economic and industrial presence in Iran from Germany. Roughly half of Iran's exports and imports by 1941 either go to or are coming from Germany, and that's because of this guy, who is the Reich Economics Minister, Hilmar Schacht, and a mechanism he puts in place, which are called the clearing agreements. That's how all of this big economic presence is arising in Iran. Reza Shah was known to be an admirer of Hitler. Nazi dignitaries paid visits. Oops, pardon me. Schacht pays a state visit to Iran in November 1936, for example. And it was said, with this German presence and the admiration of Reza Shah for Hitler, it was said that the joint British-Soviet invasion of 1941 was spurred by the presence of these Germans in the country. So this is from the New York Times. On the day of the British invasion of Iran, which is August the 25th, 1941, the British minister in Tehran, a man named Sir Reader Bullard, gave Iran's Prime Minister Ali Mansour a statement declaring that the large numbers of Germans in Iran were the reason for the attack. They were a fifth column, Bullard said. They were bent on a Nazi coup d'etat, and the Iranian government had been reluctant to remove them. Now, there were Germans in Iran. Bullard was right about that, but he's wrong on so many other things. I don't like Bullard. Bullard is often wrong. The Iranian government had agreed to remove the Germans, but had not proceeded rapidly enough, as Bullard's own letters recorded. And the actual numbers of Germans in Iran in 1941 is a matter of debate. The British command in India said that it was between 2,000 and 3,000. The former German minister in Tehran, a man named Wiepert von Blücher, said it was 2,000. The Iranian newspaper Etalat said 690. So these numbers are elastic, but beyond these numbers, who were these people? What were they doing in Iran? And were they Nazis bent on the Nazification of the country, as Bullard claimed? Well, the answer was no. There were not thousands of Nazi administrators in Iran. The thousands of Germans, there were Nazi administrators in Iran, but the thousands of Germans, what makes this number go up into the thousands, were themselves refugees. Specifically, they were refugees from the Soviet Union, which the Germans called Russlanddeutsche. And the topic of Germans in Iran in the late 1930s is really multifaceted. It takes in German diplomats, sort of Nazi, who've been, most of them Nazified, workers for German companies. Again, there are Nazis among them, but they're not all Nazis. Scientists, engineers, the families of all of these people. But it also takes in growing groups of refugees. German and German Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany who had gone to Iran. And larger groups like this, larger groups of Russian Germans from the Soviet Union. And we have some facts and figures about who they are and when they come. They begin fleeing into Iran after, in the 1930s, starting in about 1929. These are German Mennonites from the Caucasus, German Georgians from Tiflis, German Russians who had been denounced as kulaks in Ukraine and who fled or sent their women and children ahead of them. A number of the pictures of them are just women with small children into the Soviet Union has a long border with Iran. So this question of Germans in Iran at the end of the 1930s is complicated. But all of this changes with the British-Soviet invasion of Iran in August 1941. As on August the 25th, 1941, Iran is effectively moved from one global system to the other. 2 months after the German attack on the Soviet Union, Iran is invaded by Great Britain and the Soviet Union, and Reza Shah abdicated the throne on September the 15th in favor of his son. Now, this was explained by British sources as an action designed to protect Iranian neutrality. But it is, in fact, an act of war because Germany's diplomatic and economic relationship with Iran is terminated. German residents, largely, that are in the country are largely placed in internment camps. German companies are closed. Their finances are turned over to the Swedish government for liquidation. So now Iran is part of the Allied system. Here's some of the main figures there. This is Reader Bullard. Here, this is the U.S. envoy named Louis Dreyfus. And this is the Soviet envoy. I had a hard time finding a picture of him, and then the one picture I could find was appropriately hazy. I thought that was interesting. So in this Allied system, here's some facts and figures on that on this next slide. At the first point, the Tripartite Treaty of January the 24th, 1942, provides the legal basis for the presence of British and Soviet troops in Iran. And it's an interesting document. It's signed by the British, the Soviets, and the Iranians. It pledges to respect Iran's sovereignty by guaranteeing the evacuation of foreign forces at the end of hostilities, and it sets the terms for the occupation. Iran is a signatory to the document, but not an equal, certainly in practice, not in practice. Iran is not treated as an ally. Rather, Iran acquires, as it was said, quote, the status of a non-belligerent. So the U.S. is not a signatory to that treaty and is not technically an occupying power, but is a major presence in the country. And its presence is connected to the establishment and functioning of the Persian Corridor and the Lend-Lease program and the all-important supply of war material to the Soviet Red Army, which was the key to the military victory in the war over Nazi Germany. To protect the corridor, the Persian Gulf Service Command is established in the fall of 1942, and 30,000 troops arrive in December of that year. These are service troops, not combat troops. They build ports, they modernize the roads and rail service, they operate the railway, and they run the convoys north to Qazvin, which is the transfer point of these supplies over into the Soviet zone. Now, Iran's role, or Iran as a site of refuge, was marked and was larger than ever before under this British, Soviet, and American occupation of the country from 1942 onward. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, a very important international Jewish aid and international organization in the war, sets up a headquarters in Tehran in 1942 to provide aid to the Jewish refugees in the country, but also to monitor and try and support the much larger situation of Polish and Soviet Jews inside of the Soviet Union itself, and to support them when and where possible. So I find this very interesting. So not only weapons are flowing through the Persian corridor, but aid, support, food, and information do as well. The headquarters of the JDC in Tehran speaks to Iran's central place in Holocaust history, a topic which has been largely invisible until recently, or pieces of it were known. Lior's work has been very important. There's been the topic of the children of Tehran. This was a group of Polish Jewish refugee children who lived in Iran for 1 year en route from Tashkent to Tehran and then to Palestine. This was known about. But how this connected, like was this a one-off, or how is this connected to larger issues? The larger context is now very much in the process of being illuminated. And I want to, Lior's going to speak to this, but I want to mention here, this is Mikal Dekol, who's written a book on the Tehran children. And her article in Foreign Policy from October 2019, when Iran welcomed Jewish refugees, just to put down a couple of points for Iran's central place in Holocaust history, where in this article she is talking about the Polish refugees to Iran in 1942. And I pulled out this quote because it gives a sense of kind of the local context into which the refugees arrived, and kind of everything that met them, how they came and what met them when they arrived. And she said, I'll just read this here. Quote, in the summer of 1942, Bandar Pahlavi, a sleepy Iranian port town on the Caspian Sea, became a city of refugees. On its shores were clusters of tents, a quarantine area for typhoid patients, and a large area for distributing food. Outside the tented area, local peddlers hung baskets of sweet cakes and sewing thread. Those who arrived in Bandar Pahlavi on the first transports in March 1942 were placed in small hotels and in the cinema Shir o Khorshid movie theater. The gravely ill were transferred to local hospitals. The mildly ill were quarantined in a separate tent area, and the rest were shaved, stripped of their lice-infected clothes, given a blanket and a new set of clothing and underwear, and within weeks transferred to one of the 6 refugee camps in Tehran, Isfahan, or Ahwaz. Here I skipped over one of my slides here, but you see sort of the paths through which they come into Iran, where she says, and I quote, the refugees were Polish citizens who 3 years prior, with the outbreak of World War II, had fled into the Soviet Union, and now, having journeyed nearly 5,000 miles, sailed from Soviet Turkmenistan to northern Iran. More than 43,000 refugees arrived in Bandar Pahlavi in March 1942. A second wave of almost 70,000 came with the August transports. And these were Poles and Polish Jews. So they were not all Polish Jews, but there was a significant number of Polish Jews among them. But the issue that I just want to mention here, which is incredibly important, and this is an article from the German and Holocaust historian Tina Grossman, published a new German critique in the fall of 2012 called Remapping Relief and Rescue, showing the background, the important background through which these Holocaust refugees and refugees from Poland and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union come into Iran during the war. Because these were deportations inside of the Soviet Union or from Eastern Poland after the Nazi-Soviet pact and the Soviets take over Eastern Poland. There were deportations of Polish citizens, including Polish Jews, into the Soviet Union and then across the Soviet Union. And also deportations inside the Soviet Union. So here's, I wrote here, the deportations of Poles, Polish Jews, Soviet Jews, and many other minorities eastwards in the Soviet Union after 1940, which Atina lays out in her article, and there's other research on this. This is a crucial story for understanding this. This is the larger context for understanding the process that brings the refugees into Iran. So Atina speaks in her article, and I quote here, of the irony that Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union had provided a crucial, if extremely harsh and generally involuntary refuge, most importantly in Muslim Central Asia, for what she called, quote, the tiny surviving remnant of Eastern European Jewry who survived the war and the Holocaust, which she estimated at around 250,000 people, 225,000. So this is a huge topic. So at the end of the research, I'm at the end of my time, but at the end of our recent research consultation, there were two questions that really were becoming really clear, two ways to come at this topic. That the war and the occupation are fundamentally important in Iranian national history, and that this is an under-researched area. We discussed that, like, why is that so? Is it because it was a period of occupation? Why was that so? But Iran is transformed through the war and by the war in very important ways. The historiography picks up again with the Mossadegh movement, but the Mossadegh movement really has to be connected back into the 1940s to understand sort of give the deeper context of everything going on there. And then also the important place of Iran, and this is a topic, this is like a big space that's being marked out that really needs to be filled in with detailed research. The important place of Iran in Holocaust history as a site of refuge. So we were talking at the end of the research consultation about how can we bring these topics together? What are some, if we were going to map out a big research project, what would be the themes? What would be the projects? And what resources, this is where we'd like to ask all of you, what resources do we have at the U of T? Because I think we have really very special and significant resources here for this research project. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So many questions, but don't forget those questions until after the end of the talks. So next we invite Lior to deliver his remarks on Zoom.
Thank you, Anna. Do you hear me okay? Yes. Yeah, all right. I want to thank Mohammed and Anna and Jennifer and Arash for this fantastic panel and something that we really have to do more often. And it's very fitting that Jewish studies and Iranian studies teamed up to make this event happen. I'll try, so there is some overlap between Jennifer's presentation and mine. I'll try not to repeat it. Just a second. So I'll try to talk about the making of Polish Iran and see the research consultation that we organized at the Holocaust Museum was actually very useful in seeing how many more areas we have in front of us and we need to further explore. So between the three of us, I think that you will get very good idea of what else we can do. So Polish Iran, the study in Iran in the context of World War II and the Holocaust allows us to talk about World War II as a global event, as something as something that it was truly experienced in every part of the world. We can see, as Jennifer hinted at the end of her comments, how the war really shaped Iran, not just during the war, but also in the aftermath. But it was also true to other places in the Middle East, and Iran is a key place that allows us to turn the eye into to more constructive understanding of the history of World War II, and also it allows us to examine the missing pieces of the puzzle of the Jewish experience in the Holocaust, because this was seeing how Jewish Iranians experienced the Holocaust, seeing the Jewish refugees experience in Iran during during World War II and the Holocaust, and also we can, turn the table a little bit and see how European refugees were treated in Middle Eastern countries when they needed a place of refuge or shelter. Just very brief background. The story begins with the non-aggression pact that was signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union that divided Poland into Soviet zone and Nazi zone. The Soviet zone in the east. After September 1st, the beginning of World War II, the Soviets did what they did in almost every Soviet occupation zone, and this was Sovietization of the place and removing class enemies from the occupation area. In Poland, we are talking about 1.8 million Poles that were deported to Siberia and the gulags in Siberia and Central Asia. Fast forward 2 years later, after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, the exiled government of Poland in London asked Stalin to grant amnesty to the prisoners of war. Stalin agreed, and the Red Cross and other aid organizations went to see, the condition of the Polish prisoners, and to their horror, out of 1.8 million after 2 years, only 800,000 survived. They needed places of relocation for them. The easiest destinations were India, that was under British control, and then Iran, that came under the Soviet British occupation. The idea was that they will be organized in military, those who are able will be organized in military units under the command of Vladislav Anders, and will join to support the fighting forces in World War II. We usually talk, in the archival documents in the West, the British archives, the Red Cross, there was an official number of 40,000 refugees that were agreed. This is the number that was agreed upon between the Polish government, between the Iranian government and the occupation forces. But in fact, we know that only in March 1942 alone, over 120,000 refugees came to Iran. In 1 month, crossing the Caspian Sea and land crossing. Most of them came through Bandar Pahlavi. They underwent medical examination. Many of them faced severe medical conditions, starvation, and one of my interviewees was a Polish Jewish. He was 16 at the time. He joined the Anders Army, but he came to Iran. He came to Bandar Pahlavi. This was for many of them the first taste of freedom after 2 years. He walked around. He saw a bucket of butter, and he just ate until he passed away. Passed out, sorry. And he was taken to hospital, but he said that he couldn't stop himself from eating the butter because this was such a taste of freedom for him. The Poles went from, this is in Bandar Pahlavi, Polish cemetery, that for those who made it to Iran but didn't make it further, they were taken by trains, mostly to Tehran, Isfahan, and Ahvaz. And because of the large concentration, they immediately had changed the urban landscape in those places. The idea was in the beginning to keep them in refugee camps, former military bases in the outskirts of the cities. This was also a source of tension between the Jewish community, the JDC as one of the administrative organizations. But very quickly, those refugees found the way to move into the cities, and there was some contention between the refugees and the Jewish community. First of all, the Jewish community was organized to support the refugees. They raised money, and one family that owned hotels gave pretty much all their hotel rooms to the refugees for unlimited time. Other families gave food and shelter in their home, and so on. But there was also an idea that we can look at it as reverse Orientalism. They looked at the refugees as those who are poor, out of place, cannot represent themselves. They embarrass them in some ways. For example, when some of the Polish Jewish female refugees went to work in bars and restaurants, there was a very angry letter of one rabbi that said that one Iranian Jewish rabbi that said that this is a source of embarrassment to the community, that Jewish women should not be part of this entertainment services. So the refugee camps were effective only to some extent in terms of keeping the refugees outside of the cities. In fact, in Tehran, there is until today an Ashkenazi synagogue that was built in 1941, 1942. It's no longer it no longer functions as an Ashkenazi synagogue, but it's still there, and it says the sign at the entrance says that it's for the European Jews, this mass of refugees created new leisure culture that was needed in Iran. Many of the Polish women that themselves were from relatively high class in Poland just before the war found themselves now as consultants to new urban middle class women in Iran, beauty consultant, and they brought with them leisure culture of music, of jazz music and pubs. And one of the establishments that worked in Tehran during that time and served not just the Iranian clientele but also American, Soviet, and British service persons was Cafe Polonia. These are just some of the images. They had charity events and concerts to support the community institutions. So they had studios to study Persian, and they printed newspapers, Polish newspapers. There was Polish Scouts and other cultural institutions. This is Camp Polo in Ahvaz, which is short for Camp Polonia. And again, when we want to see how it affected Iran beyond just the interaction between the Poles and the Iranians, we can look at a series of events that basically ushered Iranian history from 1941 until the end of the occupation in 1946, and this is the bread riots in 1941, 1942. This is, I think, is a prime example for the relations between Iran, Iranians, and the refugees. There was shortage of food. Britain did not deliver on its promises to give more supply to Iran of rice and wheat, but where I looked to see how the anger and frustration is taken out on the refugees, and what I found was that the anger was against Britain, against the Soviets, but not against the refugees. So there was attempt of right-wing parties and newspapers to put the blame on the refugees, but overall, it wasn't an argument that took root in Iran. This is another irony of history, is seeing how the occupation basically opened up the political sphere, which is not something that we intuitively think about, for countries under occupation, but this was the end of Reza Shah's Iron Fist policy, and when he was removed, Iran, the forces of the occupation, allowed political parties from the Tudeh on the left to fascist right-wing organizations on the right to operate freely, which was a new thing in Iran at the time. It was the beginning of the Tudeh party, which I think Arash is going to cover. It brought some political instability because there was no inherent system that could balance the political development and the political institutions. The occupation lasted until almost a year after the war, which was also a source of tension, and we are aware of the establishment of the Republic of Azerbaijan and the Kurdish Republic in 1945, 1946 as an attempt to lift the occupation, or as part of the legacy of the occupation, and the strikes in 1946 that we can see as the first step towards the ascendance of Mossadegh in 1951. This is, I think, also part of the of World War II legacy. I'll stop sharing here. I wanted to finish quickly because I have to leave soon, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Again, wonderful presentation, and such a privilege to learn from you, although from afar, maybe next time in person, right, Lior? Yeah, that'd be great to see.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So, hi, Leo. Just a question to understand the context in terms of numbers. You said 1.8 were forced to go to Russia. And then out of that 1.8, only 800 survived, right? And then I want to ask, how many of those were sent to Iran in total? And then how many of those who were sent to Iran were Jewish? And if you can, at the end, tell us, what was the population of Iranian Jewish community at that time? Just
All right.
get us-
All right. So yeah, about 1 million people of the Polish refugees died in the 2 years between 1939 and 1941. We know that 450,000 were sent to India, and the numbers that I found of those who arrived in Iran ranges between 280,000 to 400,000. I think that 400,000 is a bit too much based on what I saw, but I assume that somewhere in the area of 300,000 would be a good guess. Out of them, there were about 35,000 Jews. The population, or the size of the Jewish community at the time, and this is something that we know because of the JDC that surveyed the Iranian Jewish population in 1941 when they came to work to support the arrival of the Polish refugees. In 1941, there were 100,000 Jews in Iran. And this includes a recent wave of Iraqi Jews that came after the Farhud in Iraq earlier that year. So we're talking about 100,000 Jews in Iran before the arrival of the refugees.
Questions? Yeah, go ahead.
What about the Jews from other countries other than Poland? Could you please tell us, I mean, after all we know, the Iranian Oskar Schindler, I mean, the famous politician who helped so many Jews to come back to Iran more than, I want to know, besides the Jews who came from France to Iran, were there, Jews from other countries as well who would come to Iran?
There was a small community of German Jews that Jennifer mentioned, the work of Atina Grossman that is now working on a book on the German expats in Iran. It's an interesting community. It's very small. Now, the story of Sardari is itself under consideration, and we talked about it in the workshop as well. The Sardari, the Iranian diplomat, he gave Iranian passports, but they didn't end up going to Iran. Those who received, as far as I know, they didn't end up going to Iran. They just used it to survive, to flee Nazi occupational zone. So it didn't add additional number of Jews Jewish refugees from other countries. There was the second biggest community in Iran was the Iraqi Jewish community that arrived in two arrived in two waves in the early 1920s, and 1914 to 1920, and then 1941. And then you have smaller communities of Afghan Jews, of Bukharan Jews, but we cannot really count them because they were very much in contact with the Iranian Jewish communities for generations. So they were not new, and they were not counted as foreigners for that context.
I think we have a question online from Maggie. Maybe you can unmute yourself and ask.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Sternfeld, thank you very much for the presentation. Question: the conflict between the refugees, the Polish refugees, and their Iranian Jewish community sponsors in Iran. You mentioned the dreaded word, Orientalism, an interest of mine. Now, it was the European Jews who thought of the Iranian Jews as the Orientalists, or the other way around, and also just connecting to that, how did, in this Oriental situation, how did the Polish women sort of became these cultural references and connection with the upper class Iranian women, which I would assume they were not all Jewish, and I'm quite interested to see how that Occidentalism, that European cultural life took so much space in the midst of Orientalism?
And thank you for this question. I try to be very brief, and I
Yes.
probably didn't do justice to the seriousness of the topic.
Yes.
I first of all, the impact, the reversed Orientalism that I mentioned was only one tiny aspect. It didn't characterize the relationship between the Polish Jews and the Iranian Jews. I mentioned it because the Iranian Jews felt very comfortable in being the receiving, being the welcoming community.
Yes.
And they thought of the European Jews, of the Polish Jews, as community of people that had no source of support, no agency. They were uprooted, and you know, and they also thought of them as, I mean, the example that I gave of the rabbi that was outraged at the Jewish women that went to work as waitresses. This was one example of how they embarrass us. They don't represent our Jewish culture. They just look bad. But there was also a more significant impact of this encounter, and this was the understanding of what's the role of Zionism in Jewish life during World War II and afterwards. For Iranian Jews or Iranian Jewish thinkers, this helped to formulate the idea that Zionism is necessary for those who cannot stay in their homes, and they meant the European Jews. So they moved their support to the idea of Zionism, but not for them. They were now on the verge of upward mobility. They didn't see Zionism as a solution for them, and this encounter with the European Jews helped to formulate it.
So the idea was essentially brought up and grew amongst the Jewish community in Iran. The Zionism part, okay, and then the part of the women emancipation. I mean, not emancipation, but
So
a comment on that.
That
was the most interesting part.
So I actually published an article on this. Is the main argument of how the Polish women basically transformed or became the representatives of the Polish culture in Iran. This is the simple answer is because most of the men were part of the military, the Anders Army and other institutions, and women stayed behind to build their lives or survive until later time would come. So those who were deported from Poland were upper middle class, bourgeoisie, capitalists. They were those who were, they knew what
they knew France.
Yeah, they knew what constituted life of middle class. And in Iran, the urban middle class was relatively new phenomenon in the 1940s, especially with this influx of its new economy. And Iranian and Polish women opened factories. They found themselves in the entertainment industry. There is a beautiful story that Joel Syre, who was the New Yorker reporter in Iran at the time, wrote on a beauty parlor that was operated by four Polish refugees, for Polish women refugees, and most of their clientele was Iranian women that were part of this new middle class, and they had very good business. And after a short time, an Iranian policeman didn't like that the business was operating. He didn't like that the business had no license, and he told them that because of the law and regulation, they have to shut down their business. They were very disparaged, and then one of the clients told them that, if the Iranian law is as such that if you marry an Iranian man, you become Iranian citizen, and then you can keep your business legal. So the three of the owners married the same man.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And
Very interesting. Thank you.
continue to flourish.
Yes.
Lior, do you have time to answer one more question and then you go, or you have to go teach?
One question.
Okay, so the person online, Saeed Hariri, maybe unmute yourself. Speak.
Yes, thank you, Professor Storma, for your great presentation. Question is, of the population of the Polish Jews who arrived in Iran at the end of the war, how many settled down in Iran and how many moved to other parts of the world? I know I myself had a couple of friends who were descendant of those Polish people, but based on your research, how many really settled down in Iran? Thank you.
Thank you. So immediately after the war, we know of about 10% of the Poles that wished to stay in Iran. I think that among the Jewish population, it was even smaller number. But the community pretty much almost vanished by 1979. So it's not, right now we have memories of community and not any real continuation of this community.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking Professor Sternfeld. And have a good class. I apologize to your students for being late. Okay, Arash, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'll start now. Professor Chetan just mentioned that it's my return to my campus, and it is a great honor, and to be speaking next to my old professors, to whom. Sorry, exactly. To whom I still have the same deference as the student time, but less fear, perhaps. So
that's a big mistake.
Definitely, yeah. But it's great to be back. The common theme here, and inevitably, I'll also repeat some of the points of the two other presentations. The common theme here is a story of really three different fields of historiographies, and our goal being an interpolation of them, basically. That is of the global Second World War, which is, after all, a world war, you sometimes forgotten, of the Iranian history, Iranian second Pahlavi period, basically first and second Pahlavi period, and the history of the Holocaust, of course. A lot is happening here on all sides, and the fact that there is an absence of each of this in each other, basically, I think is a shame, and it's something that this great work, is going to. And I think none of you actually mentioned the series of workshops that you and Lior and others organized at the Iranian Studies Association in Vienna about 9 years ago now. Before I had the misfortune of being here, 2016, having entered, I was still a student. Yeah. So obviously, I want to be clear that, of course, we're continuing this kind of work, and I'm not sort of. I think we're learning from this work from before, and hope to continue it. So here, do I admit everyone? That
yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the global 1941 moment, what I call a global 1941 moment, and talk about what it means to me as a historian, and where does Iran play a role there. So if you ask anyone, in whether scholars of the Second World War, historians of the Second World War, or public memory, I guess, in the United States, certainly, in the Soviet Union, what are the two big events of the 1941? 1941 is really the year that changes the course of the war. And it changes the course of the war, which means, let's be honest, it changes the course of world history. I'd like to tell my students, usually who are as you know, born now after, they're born in the 21st century, right? It's a moment I realized a couple of years ago that all of our students are now born in the 21st century. I sort of like to tell them that this boring history class that you have to take and show up at 8 a.m. to it really directly explains all your life today, because the fate of that battle and what happened in those wars really helped determine. Anyway, so what are those grand events? The ones that we know very well is, of course, the Hitlerite invasion, the Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, and Japan's attack on the United States, the Pearl Harbor attacks. But the same year is also, of course, a key year in Iranian history. I was a little kid when I remember my grandfather talking to me about, Shahrivar Hezar the Beast, which he remembered. This is the date of the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. It's kind of actually very fascinating when you think about it. I would say that if this is the kind of stuff that would be great to do surveys about. If you ask our average Iranians, I think they all know about Shahrivar Hezar the Beast. But if you sort of ask them to talk about the context and what it means in terms of globally, that's not always there. I know that it was part of the Second World War, but the focus is on Iran, and justly so, because it's a very important moment in Iranian history. It's a very key moment in Iranian history, because not just because a king changes, we have a lot of those. Of course, Reza Pahlavi, Shah, is replaced by his young son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, but because a moment of relatively free press and democratic rule starts, basically. That ends with the 1953 coup. So when you had Mossadegh's pictures directly linked to this story. So in Iranian history, this really obviously matters a lot. But it matters a lot globally as well, and Iran's role really matters, because 1941 is also the beginning of something else. Before 1941, of course, Soviet Union had been allied with Nazi Germany because of the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939. And Soviet Union didn't represent just the country. It wasn't just the country of Soviet Union. It had a dual role. Stalin's Communist Party had a dual role as a ruling party of the Soviet Union, but it was also head of a massive global movement that is world communism, that had millions of followers all around the world. Again, it's something that I sort of, when I try to tell the students and sort of ourselves thinking about it, we don't have anything equivalent in today's world. Communism as a global movement controlled the mass working class parties in Italy, in France, in Britain to a lesser degree, but a still considerable degree, in Spain. We don't have anything like that. It was a global movement. So what really happens in 1941 is that the relationship of this global communist movement that represented working classes and intellectuals, important sections in a lot of societies all over the world, and I really mean again all over the world, it changed the relationship to the Allied. And communism in the Middle East, it found a new opportunity. It found a new opportunity because communist parties, which had been illegal before, obviously, like in most countries in the Middle East, one way or the other have been illegal. I don't have a lot of time to go into details, but so when we were talking about the Middle East, Iran is obviously a sovereign state. The Arab countries are all League of Nation mandates, but they're all in Britain and France. All of a sudden, all these countries are run by the Allied. Communists are our friends. You can be active. In fact, we encourage you to be active, because what are you going to do? You're going to help the war effort. And it's very important because the communists pledge, for example, that the workers should not go on a strike. You shouldn't go on a strike hurting the war effort. The war effort takes preeminence over everything else. And the communists work closely with Allied everywhere, from Japan to China. That's also the case in Iran. So in Iran, the Communist Party of Persia and Iran had been basically obliterated out of existence in the 1930s due to a combination of Reza Shah's repression and Stalin's actually suppression of this party. Stalin basically invited all the leaders of the Communist Party of Persia in Soviet Union, and they never went back. It's one of the craziest actually examples of this. In fact, in this era, there's sort of, when you look at diplomatic records, Stalin at some point says, well, if you're going to invade Iran, how about the communists there? And they sort of almost go back and say, well, Comrade Stalin, you killed all the Iranian communists. But in 1941, it's a new moment. and the Tudeh Party is founded in 1941. And if I just say something here that always bothers me about the historiography of the Tudeh Party of Iran, which is founded by communists in 1941, it's often mentioned that, well, this wasn't a real Marxist-Leninist party because it spoke the language of unity and it spoke positively of allied, it spoke of workers and intellectuals. That's the most communist thing you could do in 1941. That was the line of the communist movement. They spoke like that, but they were as communist as anything. There was no doubt about that this party was founded on that basis. And unfortunately, Iranian historiography, you find a lot of this, saying that it's not a real, I don't know what a real Marxist-Leninist party looked like, but this was similar to how French, Italian, and other communist parties at the time looked. So 1941 is this new opportunity, and you see what I'm trying to do both globally and Iranian history. Iranian history is very important, right? The Tudeh Party is founded. It is going to be the most consequential party in the next few decades of Iranian history. Arguably, the most important political party in Iranian history. I mean, I don't think we've had another party that has operated like a political party like the Tudeh Party, right? As in with mass membership. For the first time, of course, it has religious minorities like Jews and Christians are able to join. Women enter new political life. Anyways, so internally it matters, but globally, Iran is now what we can call a bridge of victory. I'm glad that the picture that I use is of a different angle, so at least it's the exact same picture.
I love it how Churchill's also, that was deliberate, that he was supposed to sit down lower.
They put him down, yeah. This is one of the fascinating things about this conference is how Stalin and
FDR,
Roosevelt really hit it off. And Churchill is actually kind of really pissed off about this. The sign of it is, one important sort of anecdote is when Stalin sort of suggests that, we're going to shoot all the German officer class after the war. And Churchill gets really angry and says, this is not, how we fight wars. And basically at some point Roosevelt just starts laughing and says, we almost had him. We were just joking about this. They were joking this, so they had made this joke together. And of course, Roosevelt had met Churchill many times before, but this is the first time these guys meet. This is November 1943. But look, there's a lot in this image. As Professor Jenkins said, unfortunately, the Iranian context is often put out of that. The point isn't that this is just a place they meet. Iran becomes what they call a bridge of victory. Why is it a bridge of victory? And if you sort of ask Iranians bridge of victory, Google bridge of victory, you get a picture of an actual bridge. I think most Iranians in the crowd would recognize this is the Veresk Bridge in northern Iran, a pride of Iranian Iranian engineering, part of the Iranian Trans-Iranian Railway. There's a great book by Mikia Koyagi on the Trans-Iranian Railway that goes into this aspect of bridge of victory and all that. It's, I owe my knowledge of that to his work as well. But one thing that does bother me is that this is a very nice bridge, but the bridge of victory isn't this. It's Iran as a whole, right? Yeah. This something like 50% to perhaps a majority of the aid that the United States gives to the Soviet Union in the Lend-Lease program that determines the fate of the Second World War goes through Iran. And when I'm teaching this to my students, sometimes I feel like this crazy Iranian uncle guy who's just trying to say how important Iran is, but it really is important, right? It's a keynote in the Second World War. And the part of it that interests me as a sort of a workers' history and communist history in Iran is that this communist aspect again. It sort of really matters here because we have a global communist movement that makes an alliance in 1941. What Eric Hobsbawm, Marxist historian, later will call the Grand Alliance, right? In 1941, there's a very important moment in world history, what happens that the global communist movement says to the world's leading states, the global capitalist state, that will declare a ceasefire on our fight because there's a scourge called Nazism and that we'll have to defeat. That fascism is something that will destroy human civilization as we know it, and these two, if you will, traditions of the Enlightenment encapsulated in capitalism and communism have to unite together to defeat it. So this is globally really matters, but in the Iranian context, also unfortunately, I couldn't find the posters that I wanted. I really thought I had them, so when I was putting this together, but I couldn't find it. But in Mikia's book, there are many accounts, and there are many posters that actually use this phrase. So Iranian workers and to the party use the phrase. They're very proud that the railway that they built and they operated throughout the war was a bridge of victory. So what this really matters is that the Iranian workers had a contribution to the war effort that was conscious. They weren't just sort of, because often the way the story of the war told is that, well, this hapless country, Iran, we are invaded by the grand powers, and we can't do anything about it. We're invaded, and we have to sort of endure the occupation, and then it ends, and then, there are sort of different discourses about that. If you remember, there was recently a lot of anger in Iran when the British and the Russian ambassador took a picture in the Soviet embassy, where exactly on these chairs they took a sort of picture without the American being there, and so there was the idea that this is a moment of shame for Iran. There's also this grand myth. I love this stuff. Iran is full of historical myths. My favorite is these guys came to Iran and they didn't even they didn't even inform the Shah. It's not true. Of course, they informed the Shah, and the Shah met all of them. Yes, he wasn't a central player, but it's not true that they didn't let Shah know, which is one of those crazy facts that people say. Anyways, the Iranian workers' contribution to the war effort was conscious. It wasn't that, they believed in that stuff, and they believed that via to the party to a large degree. Not only the to the party, there are also non-communist workers who are part of this war effort. Okay, to the party has a very important role to say, look, there's this global battle, anti-fascist global battle, and we are taking part in it. So Iran is central to the Second World War, and now because of Professor Jenkins' great work and his status, this thing that phrase that you use, that is the most important non-combatant zone. I just say it everywhere, and I say according to Professor Jenkins. So that's that works.
It's vital.
Works for me. Yeah.
No, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, jokes aside, this really is the fact. And so ask yourself, if you get books about the Second World War, narratives of the Second World War that basically don't mention Iran, there's something definitely missing here, right? And as I think this political context of the Communist Alliance that breaks with the Cold War, basically. And to continue about what does this Communist Alliance mean, right? Again, this is very important. I want to emphasize this, what this means for political history of Iran and political history of communism. Communism, of course, had been born as this ultimate illegitimate movement for the powers that be, right? The 1917 revolution in Russia, born to the Soviet state, it was seen as like the Spartacus uprising by themselves, right? They see it as like a revolt against the status quo. The Soviet Union is an illegitimate state. It's not, people don't have, it's like the Taliban at first, like the world countries don't have relationship with it. Slowly by slowly, in the interwar era, it starts establishing relationships. But the Communist parties are by definition illegal. They're really not part of power anywhere. In the 1930s in France, they're part of the power briefly as part of sort of popular frontism in the late 1930s in France and Spain. But that has gone on to the defeat. Things have changed. In 1945, the Communist parties are now the victors of the Second World War, right? It's fascinating to think about the relationship of power and materiality, politics and power, because the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942, 1943 is one of the main reasons people join the Communist Party at some point in Iran and in other places. I.e., the Soviet Union is winning against fascism and they're joining it, right? There are people who were actually, tons of people who joined because of that. Okay, so in the post-war, now the war has finished, 1945, the war finishes, the Soviets and the Allied win. This is a triumphant moment. It's also a terrible moment. In many ways, the crimes of the Holocaust that I'll sort of mention there as well are being known for the first time. In Soviet Union, there are, by the way, and I think it's important to acknowledge, they're not really commemorated as the Holocaust, right? I.e., these are the Jewish victims of the Holocaust are mentioned as sort of victims of the Russian motherland, right? That their Jewishness as such is not recognized in those years. I'll tell you why I think this matters here and how it's sort of what role it plays in my story. But yeah, so I won't repeat the stuff about the Iran as a conduit for Holocaust survival, which others mentioned. But anyways, in 1946, so now Tudeh party is in a new position of strength. Again, to illustrate how this is part of a sort of a global phenomenon, I have here the picture of Louis Saillant. Now, who is Louis Saillant? He was one of the leaders of the French Communist Party. At this point, he is the head of this World Confederation of Trade Unions. For this little happy moment after the Second World War, all trade unions in the world, whether they're from capitalist countries led by social democrats like British Labour Party, or the communists, they form an organization together. It doesn't last long. It splits in 1949, and throughout the Cold War, obviously they're going to have the separate organization. But this is the little happy moment. But Louis Saillant can claim he represents hundreds of millions of workers around the world, and not just communist workers, right? He is a communist himself. He's from the French Communist Party, but this represents all the workers. And he is really, I have tons of material to show about this, but I didn't sort of put them on here, but he is really greeted everywhere in Iran as a big celebrity, right? These are sort of communist press at the time. You see they sort of do his, they do his caricature, not caricature, like they do his pencil still, and that's 80,000 workers in Tehran show up to greet him, allegedly. He goes on a tour around the country. What I love about the newspapers at the time, on the first page is like, it's not just communist newspaper, like, sort of the daily press, Etalat, if you look at the time, it says, the schedule of Saillant today, right? So he's really this big celebrity, and this really means something for the communist movement. Because it has this sort of international validation. This is who we are. From a persecuted little party, we are now this party. And it is also in 1946, in fact, almost exactly the time as Saillant is in Iran, where the biggest general strike in Iranian history happens in Abadan. That's sort of focus of my work, the chapter of my dissertation, of what this really means. And Tudeh actually joins the government briefly in 1946 for a few months. It joins the government of Qavam, so it's important. So the Second World War helps move communism from a underlying, exiled movement to government. And I'll tell you one sort of funny anecdote here is Eskandari, who is in this picture, is one of the leaders of the party, who becomes a cabinet minister. His uncle used to always tell him, you don't understand anything about politics. Because he was from a princely family. It's like, we're from a princely family. You're supposed to go and be friends with power, not go get yourself, busy with this foolish youthful matters. I love that one. Yeah, she's sure that. Yeah. So actually has the best cartoons there.
Iran as a result of this.
Yes, exactly. They're saying that's what Iran's become. So so the uncle says, you shouldn't get yourself involved in these foolish things. And when Eskandari becomes a cabinet minister, he gives his uncle a call, basically. Well, not a call because we don't really have telephones, but he talks to the uncle and he says, well, guess who became a cabinet minister first? Like, all your big power politics actually got me first. So it's a very important moment. Towards the end of my talk now, I want to talk about sort of also, how this history of communism in Iran relates to history of Jewish activity, Jewish political activity in Iran, and sort of what I call to be the first commemorations of the Holocaust, which is very early, actually, even by world historical standards, late 40s, 1950s. Okay, so the Iranian religious minorities had traditionally been basically not allowed to join political parties. There are still political parties in Iran, not all of them, right? There are Tudeh is not the first one to accept, but it's the first one to accept on very large numbers, I guess. There are actually today even political parties in Iran. I don't know if you've seen it. Not even political parties, just association. The first line usually says like, you need to be sort of a Muslim and a citizen. That's of Iran, right? But that was the case for many parties. The Tudeh party is obviously not that. So it gets a lot of Jewish members, partially because this is the only organization sort of Iranian Jews can join. And Lior Sternfeld works had sort of talked extensively about that. I want to talk about this paper called Bani Adam, which is the organ of an organization called Cultural and Social Society of Iranian Jews. If you know anything about communist politics in this period, it's a front. Okay, the culture, it's a front for the communist movement. So yes, it is a Jewish association. It's definitely from the Iranian Jewish community, but it also works as a conduit for the Jewish community. I love when sort of this. It's fun with the reviewers, because sometimes they sort of ask, "Oh, how do you know it's a front?" And then you have to say, "Well, if they repeat everything that the Communist Movement and Tudeh Party says week after week after week, that's probably not accidental, right?" At any rate. So what we see here is that it really, and I guess Lior's work talks about how this is the integration of Jewish political life in Iran. The Iranian Jews are really become, via the party and via these associations, become a very active part of the Iranian political scene. A lot of them are writers, and not just, when I first met Lior, when I was much younger, and sort of I was a research assistant actually, 10 years ago or something, I was shocked that some of these big writers that I knew were Jewish, which is their Jewishness had been totally forgotten, like Rahim Nanvar. Everybody knows Rahim Nanvar was an important Iranian sort of communist journalist and a writer, but his Jewishness had not been centered. In this period, the Tudeh Party also has an interesting relationship to the State of Israel that is newly founded. The Tudeh Party asks for the Iranian government to recognize the State of Israel and establish relations with it, in line with what had been the Soviet Union's position at the time. I kind of want to get to the finish line here, but this is a very interesting point. Bani Adam obviously very enthusiastically, Bani Adam's politics in this period is, communism is great. Look at these new socialist states being built in Eastern Europe. Of course, there are states being built under Stalin's dictatorship in many ways. It does not give a fair picture of them, but at any rate, I'm just describing what the politics is at the time. But also has a very strong sort of Jewish element, and it talks about the Jewish life in Israel, also criticizes the government of Israel, but nevertheless celebrates the fact that this new Jewish nation state is founded there. It advocates for the Palestinian rights in the new state of Israel as well from time to time. But at any rate, this is its general politics. And important for our sort of state of our conversation, we also have, I'm giving you as a background, so it wouldn't be surprised to you that since the Jewish themes really matter here, this is where you read sort of class analysis of the Bible, things like that, like a Marxist analysis of the Bible. You also, of course, have a commemoration, what I would call sort of a commemoration of the Holocaust, which is to say the word Holocaust is not used, by the way, right? But anytime anti-Semitism now rears its head in Iranian society, the answer that Bani Adam sort of gives is that, well, anti-Semitism is what the Nazis did, and the new world we are building should surely be different, right? So this is the spirit of the United Nations. So when pan-Iranists, for example, attack Iranian Jews, which they did at the time because they were anti-Semitic, they attack and sort of beat them up, the answer that the Bani Adam and Tudeh and stuff puts up is that, it's very interesting. The answer is appealing to the United Nations, basically saying, now we have a United Nations. This is not what we're supposed to do in the new world. And also they sort of say, Jews are anti-imperialist. So when Mufti of Jerusalem, who at that point sort of had right-wing politics, the former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem is a British appointed guy there, who is now sort of a leader. He gives an interview to Kayhan and he says sort of these anti-Semitic things. Bani Adam gives an answer that says, well, no, this is not true. Jews are actually allies of anti-imperialist movements. And as I said, very early commemorations of the Holocaust. Now, I'll just end it there. But I'm saying, how is this commemoration of the Holocaust happening? So, for example, when neo-Nazis hold a congress in Paris, sort of it denounces them, obviously. This is funny. Anyways, that's irrelevant here. It's my friend's grandfather, who was the Iranian Jewish MP at the time, was sort of attack of sort of getting some sectarian attacks. But the way I'll just end it at that. The way Holocaust is, what do I very confidently say? What I very confidently say is a commemoration of Holocaust, as opposed to like the Soviet approach, which they didn't necessarily mention. I mean, I'm sure the Soviet Yiddish press did, but the main Soviet, no, not really. Well, you would know. But so the phrases they use is like the crimes of the Auschwitz and Majdanek, for example. That obviously is very clearly referring to the Jewish people, and they use it to oppose, let's say, the anti-Semitic attacks that they're receiving in Iran at the time. So I'll end it here and say that in this period, late 1940s, early 1950s, one of the reasons I think that it has been neglected is that it doesn't fit what comes after, because obviously this stuff doesn't last. This warm relationship with communism and the state of Israel doesn't last. The relationship with communism and the world capitalist countries don't last. Iran having a free press of any kind doesn't last, and things change forever. But if history is one thing, for me at least, as historians of Menshevism used to say before, sometimes you need to study those who lost and didn't win. So that's the spirit in which I study that.
Benjamin.
Exactly. Sorry, I went over.
So much.
No, it was great.
Arash,
That
thank
was
you
great.
so much, Jennifer, for these wonderful comments. Okay, so we have like millions of questions online, but I think we should start with the audience here, because you have to get rewarded for, being
I might just take a
person.
note on my phone so I'm not just like tweeting or something.
I'm going to stand up and make sure I see everyone. Does anyone want to start?
That
the
was
discussion?
fascinating. That was great.
Thank you so
That was
much.
And then
fascinating.
you'll go next.
So I can. You see, during the Second World War, we have seen the insulting behavior of the Allies towards Iranians. We suffered hunger. We Iranians suffered hunger, and since many domains and aspects of history are the sites of actually doubts and uncertainties. I believe the title that they gave us perhaps was a sort of compliment in order to cheat, in a sense. And at the same time, you see, we should not forget that even if there was an element of truth behind that, perhaps it was because of the role of the oil in the Second World War. Because, after all, victory was gained through the Russian oil. For the tanks, for the cars, in the Second World War, because at that time neither Saudi Arabia, neither Kuwait, neither other countries had oil. It was only the Persian oil which was used. I think if there wasn't, we have to look if we are after a sort of tangible reason.
The Soviet Union
That's
had
why after
Do we take a few questions?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, yes, go ahead, please. And then you in the back. Three questions.
My question has to do actually with what Jennifer said towards the end of her presentation regarding the project that we were envisioning. And it seems that after what you described, we had in Iran the largest Jewish community of any Muslim country in the world. This is after the Second World War. Leading up to the revolution, I'm wondering, as part of what Jennifer proposed, this idea of what was Jewish life in Iran like after the Second World War compared to any other Muslim country out there, and including some of the more controversial aspects of it, which is the Mossad training, the Savak and repression, and pulling nails and wiretapping and perhaps assassination, given what's going on in the world these days. And I'm wondering how we could use that to reflect on what's happening today, which is Iranian-Jewish relations in terms of interstate relations, rather, the worst they've ever been, arguably. The Iranian missile strikes, Israeli assassinations, and the work that Israel is doing in Lebanon and so on. So I'm wondering if the two of you could, or indeed all of us, could envision how the project that Jennifer is talking about could bring us to the present moment and this whole Iranian-Jewish nexus, if you like, how we could, as Canadians, live that in a positive way.
Wow, that's a good question.
only the easy questions here.
That's a good question.
So my question is, could you maybe explain what's the Persian perception of Zionism during this time? It was briefly touched upon by the one. Like, is there any evidence to suggest what a typical Persian would say, would think of Zionism? How familiar were they with Zionist ideas during this period of the occupation, or leading up to these?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we
You want
answer
to do
now,
the
or
fourth question? So, all right, go ahead.
you want to start, or should I?
Okay, yeah, the very first question about the food, for example. And thinking about the world war as the global war and the relations between these allies. I mean, the alliance is very important. There's also a lot of conflict between the allies. They have very different views about what to do. There's a lot of conflict between the US and the British in particular. And the British, one of the reasons for the food, the British bring Iran into the Sterling zone, and this dislocates the economy. So this was a terrible decision that the Americans were opposed to. And also the food distribution, that the food shortages in large part went back to sort of British mismanagement.
Yes.
So it's the larger sort of context of the occupation and the way that the different allies work together on the ground or don't. And then how Iran is being integrated then with being brought into the Sterling zone into a British global sort of set of networks that don't necessarily work very well. So the British and US diplomats argue a lot over food and the effects on the Iranian population of the mismanagement and the bread riots and the subsistence issues and things are like caused from the top down.
Yeah. But the humiliation was also a great factor, I would say. Humiliation. Even you have got pictures of the Iranian king who is not cared by an ordinary soldier. I've seen those pictures, for example. And I think even after watching the Iranian soldiers, that famous, آواز در واقع میشه گفت the song, Iranian.
Iran, you mean?
Iran was composed.
As a reaction,
the national anthem was composed due to that behavior, of behavior during the Second World War.
Well, could I just say one thing that so humiliation, but also points of pride. I think that what Arash was putting on the table for consideration is incredibly important. But also the U.S.-Iranian relationship during the war is probably the best it ever was. And there was a way in which the U.S. Diplomats, in which the State Department desk on Iran goes from 4 people in 1941 to 96 in 1945. So the importance of Iran to Roosevelt's policies and his vision of the post-war world, not just to the winning of the war, but also putting a stamp on the peace, are very important. And the Germans do this before. I write about this in the 19th century. The so-called third powers in Iran that are not the British and not the Russians, and the Germans do it, and then the Americans do it. They support the Iranian nationalist movement. They have an ear for Iranian nationalism. They talk about Iranian politics as politics. The British talk about it as anarchy and chaos. The British administrators and the American administrators have completely different views, just to look at those two, on Iranian politics. With the coup, of course, in 1953 is going to change all of this, and the way that the U.S.-Iranian relationship, really with the joint declaration on Iran that's signed at the end of the Tehran conference, that's a marker that's put down, and that's a recognition that's put down. So it wasn't just humiliation, and it's interesting given what happens to the U.S.-Iranian relationship, also in relation to the present day. This
one of the factors.
This early way that the U.S. supported Iranian nationalist politics, to give a very broad characterization, is interesting.
Thank you.
So you said. I love the beginning, right, at this point, that is not just the humiliation. So I do not want to downplay the terrible onslaught we suffered as Iranians during the occupation. It's a great point that Iran, it really comes, I think, from a day when Khalegi just sees an Iranian sort of person humiliated and goes. But I think, so I speak about it as an Iranian today, right? This is a question about, so it's a question of history, like as his sort of, if you look at it as history and historiography, I think we use at this point to show how Iran was important to the Second World War. We saw how Iranian workers, a lot of them took a prideful part in the war effort, right? So that's history. Now the second question is political, public historical, if you will. There I will speak as an Iranian, and as an Iranian, who loves his country, and look at this history of his country. I don't think we got I think we, and I've written about this, right? I think basically we forget all the positive things that we got out of it. So yeah, the occupation, had some terrible aspects. There was hunger, although frankly there was hunger in a lot of places. It was hard to not be hungry during the Second World War in huge sections, right? Turkey wasn't invaded, but it had its own problems. But Iran got a security of its sovereignty, a commitment of the great powers to sovereignty, and when the United Nations founded, the first ever Security Council resolution was about Iran and Iran's sovereignty against the Soviets that had occupied part of the country. So it turns out that actually Iran, it's a basic point about the world wars. If you do something and you're somehow on the winning side of the war, that's gonna go good for you, right? That's the case, and that is basically what happens out of Iran. So I don't see us. I think as one Iranian, I think that our approach to this period should be that Iran had an important role, conscious role, as I have tried to show in my work, in this global important victory over fascism. That we weren't victims of the Allied, we weren't passive victims of the Allied. We had an important role, even though we were neutral formally. I mean, we not after 1943 we declared war on Nazi Germany. Had an important role. We're part of this global, and that's why we are a founding member of the United Nations. So this has consequences, right? We have to remember all of this. That's why we have an Iranian diplomat being at the head of the United Nations General Assembly a few years after that. You don't get to do these things if Iran had gone to support the Nazis, as some had wanted it, or if its neutrality had gone that way. Not to mention that, of course, having supported the Nazis during the Second World War, would have been great, obviously. Although I want to be clear, I've tried to show in the work, I don't buy also to those who say, Reza Shah was taking Iran to the Nazi camp. There's no real evidence that he was. Your question is it's a bit broad, again, sort of supra-historical, if you will. But I think, first of all, to just establish a historical point, yes, this is very important to remember. There was a Jewish life in Iran, in the Middle East, after the Second World War. It's not hard to be the biggest Jewish community because the other ones are basically go to zero in most places. In Egypt, in Baghdad, that had been 35% Jewish until the 1940s, has literally zero Jews later. And it wasn't just the biggest then, it's the biggest now. I'm not counting Turkey. My wife is from Turkey. We always exclude it from the Middle East. Whenever it's convenient, we bring it in when it's, when it's not. So Iran continues to have, which is why, by the way, Lior Sternfeld's work, it's very. I'll just tell you this before we get into politics. I'm a pretty political guy. But it's just funny for me when inconvenient politics leads people to do crazy things. One of these crazy things is to deny that the Iranian Jews exist, or they're somehow not real Jews. They're somehow, anything that they say, they're saying it because the regime asked them to. Anybody who seriously studies this community, you can have different views. But the idea that they're somehow like fake Jews, used by the Iranian regime, I mean, it's crazy. It's not true. These are Jewish people like Jewish people everywhere. They have to live under an anti-Semitic regime that denies the Holocaust and does all these things. But they have their associations, and there are people you can speak to, online. There we have a Jewish MP. Iran has constantly had a Jewish MP. Yes, yeah, including now. These Jewish MPs, they have to work within the limits. Within the limits, but they never debase themselves. I mean, it's very important. No Iranian Jewish MP, for example, have gone on to say something like, we support the denial of the Holocaust or things like, yes, they say, we love the supreme leader, things like that you have to say, everybody in Iran has to say, unfortunately. But they are a community that exists. And this is an important part of the story. Now, you mentioned the Mossad's relationship with Savak. Iran and Israeli relations are a fascinating topic. It's also one of the things that I do, sort of. So I've given other talks on that. That's not the topic, yeah. And there is a talk that I gave in Stanford about that, that is online, about sort of Iran and Israel relations during the Pahlavi period. If there's a political point, and you mentioned Canada, which is home to both a great Jewish community, Iranian community, and inevitably an Iranian Jewish community, right? If there's a political point, I would say obviously, as a sort of a ban of peace and wanting to prevent war, anything that we can do to stop the current carnage in the Middle East and help bring about a ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon and stop the potential of war with Iran and Israel is good. And looking at these favorable historical relations, if it has a public historical role, that's great as well. Although we are academics at the end of the day, we're doing academic work, but I do hope that this can be put to good use. And the last question I'll answer about the Iranian perception of Zionism, which is a fascinating question. The first problem, when we're trying to look at this question is what do we really mean by Zionism, right? Which actually, historically and this day, it's never actually clear. Like when a person denounces or supports Zionism, they can mean everything under the earth. So I'll tell you this. The Iranian communist Jews that I showed the paper, they were, if you will, anti-Zionist, pro-Israel. And this might not make sense, but because for them Zionism was a nationalist ideology that they had criticized and they continued to criticize, just like they criticized Iranian nationalism, but they supported the Iranian nation. So for them, Israel was a new nation state that had founded by the Jewish nation. Every nation in the world had a right to self-determination. That includes Jews in Palestine. I'm saying according to their perspective. It had formed a nation, and this nation was to be supported. And the emigration of Jews to there, and that became a sort of funny topic at points, but generally was positive. Jews left from Romania, especially when they went from Eastern European countries, it would be like the grand socialist states are helping. When they left the capitalist countries was, they're fleeing the capitalist repression to the new nation of Israel. And the other thing we have to remember Israel at that period is that in the first elections instead of Israel, the first party was the Socialist Party, Mapai. The second party was the Soviet-loving, Marxist-leaning Mapam. So this is the landscape, political landscape of this country, right? So when they have a positive attitude toward Israel, they're having a positive attitude toward a country that they hope will be much more left-wing actually than it becomes. Now in the 1950s, Israel supports the US in the Korean War. It becomes very clear that it has picked the American side in this Cold War. Then there's a sprout of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union with the Prague trials in 1948 and later on with the Doctors' Affair of 1953. So this relationship gets complicated. But at any rate, so the Iranian communist Jews were critics of the Soviet Union, critics of Zionism, but they supported the state of Israel, as in they were happy that this state had sort of sprung out of the ashes of the Holocaust, and it was something that a state that they were interested in working with, and they would travel there. And the Communist Party of Israel, which was formed around the same time, and it had both Palestinian and Jewish Israeli members. In fact, the 50-50, today it continues to be like that. Today it's maybe 70% Palestinian, 30% Jewish, but it's sort of that force. And so they have a lot of relationship with it. So Tawfiq Ziad, who's this Palestinian member of the Communist Party of Israel, who's a mayor of Nazareth in northern Israel, he travels to Iran. He has a poem for Abadan. He supports Mossadegh. So there's a tons of ties there. And the last part of the answer about so this is the Iranian sort of communist Jews. Now, Iranian Jewish community as a whole, I would say the approach is this. They basically are like, okay, this state has been founded. We didn't found it. It's our fellow Jews who have founded it. It's nice that they founded the place. It would be nice to go and visit sometimes. But what is very clear is that, we're not going to live. We're from Abadan. Like, we're not going to live there, right? So there's very little. So there are Iranian Zionist activists from the 1920s and 30s and all that. But they are very hard for them to get traction for people to leave in very significant numbers. And they leave for the significant numbers in 1979 after the revolution and all that happens. But even when they leave, the United States is a much more common destination. And these are historians, Zionism, historians of Israel study this. Today, about 200,000 Israeli Jews have Iranian, partial Iranian descent. It could be one grandfather or grandmother who was from Iran, right? And so obviously there are some who move even then. But generally, the Iranian Jewish community becomes this conduit of relationship with Israel and Iran, but without moving there, because their Iranianness is very serious. I'm laughing because I said, the idea of, because sometimes I love when the question is put, why didn't they leave? I mean, whenever someone asks me this thing, why don't you leave to go somewhere else? This was their country. They faced some anti-Semitism, but not like you had in Arab countries. You know, they were in pogroms in this period in Iran. They were in this kind of activities. So they had warm relations with Israel. And you know, like people everywhere, and I guess Jewish history everywhere, they had their creative differences sometimes with Israelis. The Iranian Jewish MP Morad Arieh, at this period, you know, he would get in fight with the Israeli legation time to time. You know, and the last thing I say in this regard, in relation to anti-Semitism in this period, that's sort of unfortunate, is that that's what we see anti-Semitism usually works like this. There are differences within Iranian Jews over Zionism and what they think about the state of Israel, and difference throughout different years, right? But the differences are usually lost on anti-Semites. So Morad Arieh, who was known for having clashes with Israel, basically, not, by the way, on some like pro-Palestinian ground. He had clashes on different grounds. He basically thought Israel was a danger to Iranian Jews because it was, you know, it was changing the relationship of a community with the king to a relationship of a state with the king. But Morad Arieh, at some point, unfortunately, even left-wing groups basically called him a Zionist, and sort of, they actually sort of, there are plans to assassinate him at some point.
If I could add in here, during the war, the international aid organizations that are in Iran to help the refugees, and the Jewish international aid organizations like the JDC, they are not uniform. The JDC is not a Zionist operation. The Jewish Agency for Palestine, which is also there, is. So you don't have a uniformity of agreement on Zionism, even in that context either. It is you have different positions being taken. If I could say something about oil, because of course the oil is incredibly important, and just thinking about like the way the British are attempting to, you know, repress the kind of tactics being used by the British against Mossadegh and the nationalization of oil in the early 1950s. I mean, the sanctions, like trying to economically starve the country, all these things, you know, we see these again, you know, but also the way in which this is also about Iran being so important in sort of global developments, that what happens in in Iran in 1951 is one of the factors that brings Churchill back into office, and the defeat of the Labour government in Britain. And Churchill was at the beginning, present at the creation. That's what the way Dean Acheson put it about the EU, or about the Marshall Plan. He was there at the very beginning in 1911, moving as the First Lord of the Admiralty, the British Navy, moving the British Navy, all future building of the Navy will be based on oil. The Anglo-Persian, that the British Treasury buys the controlling share in Anglo-Persian 1914, that's Churchill. I mean, that he then comes back in 1951 for like the last gasp of his political career. Right at that moment, all of those points hook together. And the British, so the poverty of the British approach toward Iran, they make the same mistakes over and over again, but also the way that Truman also is voted out of office, Eisenhower comes in, and you have then a very different, with a different president, you have a very different U.S. administration, very different approaches being taken. So, yeah.
Okay, we'll take another round. Yes, please. And is there another question that maybe on the back? Okay, I'll ask the next question.
Would this have been perceived, if at all, as a threat to Saudi Arabia? The presence of the Jewish population in Iran.
As a threat to Saudi Arabia?
Yes. You've got all the oil, right? Saudi Arabia becomes a country in what, 53?
It was already a country.
Yeah, but you know what I mean, like. Okay.
The U.S. is building up its whole oil presence in Saudi Arabia, and sort of so the U.S. with the oil in Saudi Arabia is kind of a competing presence to the British control over Anglo-Iranian oil company, as it's then called. So I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Fine.
I'm not.
It's not qualified enough inside my head. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
And we have some questions online as well.
So, okay, I will ask you a question, and we'll give our online audience, and we'll wrap up. Is that okay?
Sure.
So I was listening to this panel, and it was very interesting. Like so many things I want to say, but I will restrain myself. You're welcome. But I guess for the Communist Party, I have to say something. You know, that approach that Zionism is for Jews somewhere else and for local it's okay, that's exactly the Soviet approach. Although in the Soviet Union, it lasted really from the end of 1947 to maybe the end of 1948. And then Stalin changed his mind, and then all the Jews who repeated verbatim what Stalin said ended up in trouble, arrested, jailed, sometimes even shot, and all this. So in that sense, what you presented to us about the Iranian Jewish Communist Party view of Zionism, that is not the calque of the Soviet view. And it's not even the calque of the Polish view either, because Polish, view becomes communist a little bit later, so they have their own thing and they allow people to go. In the Soviet Union, there's just desire to kind of go from the best country in the world, Soviet Union, into Palestine or newly created Israel. That's an act of treason. So the fact that not all communist parties agreed on that, that's, I think, hugely important for, at least for me, it was an eye-opening thing. And I guess to both of you, the question that I was thinking about is that, I don't know, like, where's culture in all this? So I'm curious about Iranian Jewish musicians, artists, theaters. And, like in political history, we often forget about all this, but these people form so much of what the country is, the sensitivities, values, and all this. So I know there is a story, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. But think about the answer. So now we'll ask, we lost people.
We just have Saeed.
Yeah. Okay, so Saeed, go ahead, please, with your question, and then we'll let you answer it.
Thank you very much, both Professor Jenkins and Dr. Azizi. Welcome to Toronto, and it's good to see you amongst prominent historians. Professor Jenkins, question for you. The reason that the Jews in this context, the way they treated in Iran, how much of it is politics, how much of it is cultural, and how these Jews were treated in other countries? We heard that some of them moved to India, and less than 10% remained in Iran, the rest left. I'm just curious to learn how did this happen, and how much of it was cultural and how much of it was politics. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. And here I'm drawing on what I've learned from Lior's work. He has his book is wonderful. There's an article in Jewish Social Studies published in 2018. I think it's also called The Making and Polish Iran. Yeah. It's a wonderful, wonderful article. So I learned a great deal from Lior and from Mikhail Dekel. And here I'm talking about how the Polish Jews are treated in Iran. Both of them speak from oral history accounts of refugees who arrived and just said the relief after coming to a place that felt safe. The welcoming, how they were welcomed, how their food was present, they were taken care of. They're coming out of the Soviet Union at a time of warfare and coming from great deprivation. They first they were deported, so they're inside of a gulag system, so the conditions out of which they come, and then they come into Iran. The oral history accounts that I read about in Mikhail's work and Lior's work talk about an atmosphere of welcome and a feeling of safety, and that being so incredibly important at the time. In terms of that only 10% stay, well, most, and here I'm thinking about Atina's work, what I've learned from Atina, they wanted to go back. The Polish Jews wanted to return to Poland at the end of the war. And so these famous episodes of really vicious pogroms and a renewal of anti-Semitism in Poland in 1945, 1946, that a nationally focused history kind of has these things like explained as if it just, it's just this is Polish anti-Semitism and it's rearing its head again. There's something to that, but Atina's work and Lior too, talking about all of these refugees trying to return, that this was also that, And this is the unknown part of the story, this attempt to return to Poland, and then this massive reaction against it. And a number of these refugees move on and end up in these DP camps, displaced persons camps, in Germany. And Atina's work on the DP camps in Germany sort of sees, like, well, all of these people who are the majority of, if I'm understanding her right, majority of the people who are here are Polish refugees, and Polish Jewish refugees who survived by sort of these routes, these remapping rescue, as she called it, into the Soviet Union, then back through Central Asia, Iran, in an attempt they wanted to go back home. So, to return to Poland, and that then proved impossible. Yeah.
So, really fascinating questions. The first one is basically really at the core of my work in dissertation, and something that I really sort of try to argue, which is to say that there is a diversity and dissension on the Jewish question and on Israel inside the communist movement, right? That, that they don't, and this is the most controversial, if you will, argument when I argue that, is that if in 1947 the communist movement comes to support the state of Israel, the conventional narrative is, Stalin decides this for geopolitical reasons and communists all have to follow the line, even though they hated Zionism. I mean, I disagree with that, and I try to show that no, actually, they changed their mind because the facts on the ground have changed, and they're looking at that, and I won't get into details of that, but I will say that. So, I mean, I did mention the Prague trial, 1948, right? So there's a new anti-Semitic sort of tinge in 1948, and then 1953, and throughout the entire era, different forms of anti-Semitism exist inside the communist movement, and they lead to different kind of reactions. The last thing I'd say, as if you will, my smoking gun that shows things are not always. Not always put from above. It's not from the Iranian context. It's, as you know, the very famous book, Judaism Without Embellishment, which is a grotesquely anti-Semitic, book published by the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. It includes like caricatures of Jews with hooked noses. I mean, it's a real anti-Semitic, text. And this book basically gets destroyed in the Soviet Union. They have to pulp it. And if you look at the history, as I've tried to do, the major reason for that are the communist parties of Australia, of Italy, of France, who come and say, look, this is not the communism we signed up to, right? So ultimately, they're not able to change the face of Jewish life in the Soviet Union. They're not able to change Soviet Union relations in Israel, but they have their differences. And I will promise this is the actual last thing, is that it's important, though, that throughout the period until 1991, and actually, in fact, in some ways to this day, Communist Party's position on Israel is distinguished from other left-wing parties in that they don't call for a destruction of Israel. And they believe the solution in the Middle East is a negotiated, basically, they're two-statist before anyone is two-statist. And they never waver from this. Communist Party of Iraq, the Tudeh Party of Iran, Communist Party of Israel, Communist Party of Sudan, Communist Party of Jordan, they never waver from this, right? This becomes important in First Intifada, because in First Intifada, Communist Party of Palestine is the only party that says, we're happy with the state of Israel if it means the Palestinian state can also exist. So, yeah.
If I could just say, the question on culture is a very good one. I don't want it to get lost, and I'm really sorry that Lior is not here, because I think he could give the most direct answer, but certainly it's if we're thinking about trying to get inside this occupation from the inside, right, and to look at Iran in the 1940s from the inside, all of the different cultural questions, and because culture is a big question, are going to be incredibly important.
And I'll also just say that the Jewish communists, for example, they have clubs, they have musical clubs, they have book reading clubs, they have dating clubs, kind of, that is very controversial, right? That, you can sort of meet people that are effectively things that are like the youth people meetings, which are effectively sort of this is happening. So they have a very incredibly rich cultural landscape.
But I think it's possible that music might hold, we should look into music very specifically, because it's possible that will have an even bigger influence, or a kind of connecting. I don't know, but looking at music could be very important for thinking about the refugees in Iran, the local and Iranian society, Iranian civil society, and how this all works together. Music and poetry might be important places to look.
Agree.
Yeah, and food. And food, of
I
course.
think we set up the agenda. You finished your talk, what's the agenda? I think we now have to.
But it's a great question. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well,
Thank
please
you.
join me in thanking our amazing panelists and our host for for doing this event. And thank you. I don't know what we're doing next.
I think we have food.
We're hanging out?
Yes.
We have a lovely reception.
Let's see what we have for the reception.
Okay, so thank you all. Thank you for coming.